This is the Project Management Podcast. We bring project management topics to beginners and experts. Find us on the web at www.thepmpodcast.com or send your emails to pmpodcast@gmail.com.
Hello and welcome to episode number 131. I am Cornelius Fichtner. This is the Project Management Podcast for the 8th of November 2009. Nice to have you with us. October was, of course, a bit of a dry month here at the Project Management Podcast because I was spending some needed time off with my family in Switzerland. But now I'm back, refreshed, and we are resuming our normal programming, if you will. This week's episode is on one of my favorite topics: PMOs, Project Management Offices. In particular, we are going to discuss if a PMO assessment will lead to accelerated enterprise improvement or if it's simply a waste of time. But of course, we first answer the questions: what on earth is a PMO assessment? How do you do one? And what type of results and follow-up work can you expect if you do it right? To help us look at this, I have invited Pat Zorns as a podcast guest. Pat is an executive consultant for Robbins Joya, who wrote a white paper on exactly this topic, so she has a lot to say about it. For instance, Pat says that an effectively conducted assessment can save months or even years of effort and frustration, but a poorly conducted assessment can waste not only the time to do the assessment, but valuable time afterward, implementing the wrong solution. Let's see what her recommendations are. Before we get to the interview, let me remind you of two items. First, have you told someone that you enjoy the Project Management Podcast lately? I'd really appreciate it if you told just one of your colleagues today about our program. Thank you very much. And second, we are still conducting our yearly listener survey. If you have a few minutes, I'd appreciate to hear what you think about the Project Management Podcast. Just go to thepmpodcast.com and there will be a yellow pop-up asking you to participate. You can even win a prize. We're closing the survey on November 21st. Thank you. And now, the interview. Pat Zorns is currently an executive consultant with Robbins Joya LLC, a program management consulting firm with headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia, founded in 1980. Robbins Joya partners with clients around the world to drive high-risk, complex initiatives to successful completion. Pat has a bachelor's degree from Ottawa University in Business Management, her PMP certification through PMI, and advanced studies in project management through Villanova. With over 20 years of direct experience in project and program management, Pat has provided consulting services to many large entities, including Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and the federal government. Enjoy the interview.
Project Management Podcasts Feature Interview. Today with Pat Zorns, Executive Consultant with Robbins Joya.
Hello, Pat, and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Cornelius. Very glad to be here.
Happy to have you. You wrote a paper, a white paper, in which you argue that it's possible to accelerate enterprise improvement with a PMO assessment. Why do you feel that way?
Cornelius, organizations today have more work than they can deal with, less staff, more pressure to produce results. Their business strategy is often kind of a moving target, and it seems like no one can react quickly enough. They know their projects and programs aren't performing as well as they would like, with way too many running over budget or behind schedule. But they don't have the time, the staff, or sometimes the expertise to figure out what the issues are, much less how to resolve them. It's my belief that a well-planned and executed assessment can quickly provide the answers they need to avoid failure and often reduce frustration.
What type of an assessment are we talking about here? What does this look like?
Well, we're talking about taking a close look at an organization's people, processes, and tools that contribute to project or program success or failure by defining an organization's goals and what it thinks it looks like in terms of a future state PMO, and then comparing that to where the organization is today. An effective assessment can provide specific actionable recommendations to move the organization from where it is today to where it needs to be to meet those goals. Assessments use many different types of tools. I mean, we're talking about online surveys, one-on-one interviews, focus groups, artifact reviews, inventories, benchmarking. And actually, the most comprehensive assessment will include elements of each of those methods.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it seems like you're looking at all the angles that you could look at from that point of view of the assessment.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Whenever we talk about PMOs, I like to go back to the Complete Project Management Office Handbook, second edition, by Gerard M. Hill. It's a humongously thick book. It's sort of the Bible here. And in this book, he defines 5 PMO stages. A small project office, basic PMO that manages multiple projects, maybe also multiple PMs. Then you have what he calls the standard PMO. Above that, the advanced PMO. And at the very top, you have the center of excellence, multinational PMO, really a humongous behemoth almost. Each of these gets bigger and bigger, obviously. Do you propose that we should do an assessment on any level of this? Or do you have a certain minimum, maximum size where this doesn't seem to make sense anymore?
Well, one of the biggest challenges an organization can have is to actually unwind ineffective processes that have become ingrained in their culture. Mm-hmm. So in that instance, developing a well thought out plan for growing your PMO while it is still relatively small can absolutely avoid problems later on. On the other hand, the larger a PMO is, the more extensive and impactful the problems if they aren't corrected. So to answer your question, no, there is no minimum or maximum size that can't benefit from some level of assessment. And in fact, if I were a manager that had just been given responsibility for a PMO, one of the first things I would want to do is to analyze where it is in competency, and an independent assessment is a great way to do that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think I already know the answer to my next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway here. Do you do this assessment usually as a team, or is this more like a one-person deal?
Well, as you would expect, the size of the assessment team depends on the size of the organization, how quickly it needs to be completed, where the locations are. It's always better to have at least 2 people so they can compare notes.
So you say that even when I have a small PMO, have 2 people do it anyway so that you get it from 2 angles and these 2 people can compare their notes?
Absolutely.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. And what qualifications would these people need, the people who perform the PMO assessment?
Obviously, you need the training and experience with projects and programs.
Yes.
But beyond that, you really should have a team with a depth of experience across the industry that you're working in, with various sizes and types of PMOs, so you have that wealth of data to draw from. And having worked with various other PMOs, both those that work well and have their own challenges, the team can bring like real-world best practices to their recommendations. And while what we call the heavy lifting will be done by the core assessment team, it helps to have access in related disciplines like portfolio management and organizational change management, maybe records management, people who can look at the initial findings and provide additional perspectives and insights.
Oh, I see. So you have a core team that works on this assessment full time, but then in a specific area like portfolio management, you may bring in an external part-time specialist to help just with that. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, exactly. Either bring them into the site or more likely present your results to them so that they can provide feedback on additional questions or just insights where you would want to delve a little further.
You mentioned that if you were a new manager who's just been handed a PMO, you would start out by doing a PMO assessment to figure out its maturity. And then when would you do this the next time? Is this something you do yearly? Is this something you do at the end of projects? Is there any kind of best practice in regards to scheduling PMO assessments?
No, I don't think that you would need them yearly. I think once the initial recommendations have been provided and implemented, and that's important, you probably wouldn't need another assessment unless problems begin to reappear, at which point you would want to bring somebody in to find out why they're reappearing.
And what do you do if, let's say, your organization is indeed managing projects, but you don't have a PMO at all? What now?
This is a great time to do an assessment. But the focus obviously would be less on the current practices and more on future goals. The earlier an organization can develop and implement a plan for their PMO, the more problems they would avoid in the future.
Okay. And let's go now to the other side here. We're starting out without a PMO. What if you have multiple PMOs in your organization? Like in some organizations, you have an IT PMO and you have a business PMO. What do you do here?
Well, many organizations don't have an organization-wide policy or strategy around projects or PMOs.
Mm-hmm.
And so individual work groups frequently build their own independent policies, processes, standards, and they become inconsistent or incompatible. In this case, the assessment would focus on identifying what the enterprise is doing well, what the internal best practices from each of the existing PMOs are, ensuring that those are continued while also identifying what is missing or could be improved. Another important focus needs to be on the organization's ability to accept and adopt the changes required to meld multiple approaches, policies, or procedures. This last challenge, referred to as organizational change management, is often your biggest challenge.
But I think that's pretty much outside of the PMO assessment, isn't it? You can assess it, you can hand it back to the organization, and whether or not they then decide to react on it, that's a totally different story, right?
Well, it should be at least part of the story of the original assessment, because providing a set of recommendations when you know that an organization is absolutely not ready to accept the change is not usually a good strategy.
Okay. So you actually have to use your brain when you're doing the assessment.
Correct.
Okay. And let's also look at the situation when we do have a PMO in an organization and you find that during the assessment, previous to the assessment, doesn't really matter, you have projects that are in trouble, over budget, late, quality is not sufficient, resources lacking. What's the approach now from a PMO assessment point of view?
That's actually where we get a lot of people who are looking for assessments because, like I said in the introduction, they know they have issues, but they can't pinpoint the exact problems and they have no idea how to resolve them.
Right.
But here, the assessment can focus on the specific issues as well as establishing performance benchmarks, both internal and industry-wide, against which then you can measure the organization. Those benchmarks plus the review of the PM discipline best practices can often tweak existing processes to reduce or eliminate those specific problems.
Mm-hmm. Where do these benchmarks come from?
Benchmarks come from across both industry and PM discipline. PMI, for example, Project Management Institute, provides many best practice benchmarks against which you can measure your organization.
Okay, so these are publicly available then?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know that. All right, let's move towards the end of such a PMO assessment and let's take a look at the results, the output that we get. What kind of documents can we expect as an output of a PMO assessment?
Well, besides the actual results of all the interviews, surveys, workshops, etc., there should be a gap analysis that details the differences between where the organization is today in contrast with where it wants and needs to be, and then that should be confirmed by the participants.
Mm-hmm.
But the major deliverable is a detailed transformation roadmap that includes a time-bound set of actions the organization can take to really make a significant difference.
I see, and of course then that's the reason why we have the title of your white paper, white paper, accelerate enterprise improvement with a PMO assessment, because your primary output is the roadmap at the end of the PMO assessment.
Exactly, Cornelius.
All right. So here's my last question for you. Let's assume that our listeners here, they're now all gung-ho and they really want to move forward in doing a PMO assessment within their organization. Give us a few basic considerations here. Open up your bag of tricks for us. What do they have to keep in mind as they're now sitting down and jotting down their ideas and they want to plan their PMO assessment? What is it they have to worry about?
Okay. Well, obviously, those conducting the assessment will need access to a great deal of internal organizational information.
Mm-hmm.
So make sure that those conducting the assessment are trustworthy and willing to execute a non-disclosure agreement. And whether it's conducted internally or by an external consultant, participants must be willing and able to be completely honest and open with their input, or the results won't be valid. If it's conducted internally, the personnel will need time to conduct research on both benchmarking and best practices. They will also need to be somewhat shielded from reaction to the results of their efforts, so they can be completely honest without fear of any kind of retribution. And as I mentioned earlier, while a limited number of people will be involved in an actual on-site assessment activities, a most effective result can be achieved through the ability to reach out to a larger group of experts in fields related to project or program management. So incorporating those disciplines in the analysis can detect ancillary issues that could not otherwise be identified.
Well, thank you for your time today, Pat.
Thank you, Cornelius. I really appreciate the opportunity to reach out to your audience.
And that was our interview with Pat Zorns on PMO assessments. That's it for today. Thank you very much for listening. At this point, let me remind you of that one small favor I had asked for earlier. Please go ahead and tell just one person today about the Project Management Podcast. As always, you can find us on the web at thepmpodcast.com. And if you are a project manager who wants to become a PMP, then the easiest way to do so is with our sister podcast, the Project Management Prepcast, and study for the exam by watching over 38 hours of video training from pmprepcast.com. Please send your emails to pmpodcast@gmail.com, and when you write, please tell me where in the world you are writing from. And finally, we have this. Doing your projects right is no excuse for not meeting the schedule. Until next time.